Oh, good morning, Protege. Of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite afternoon class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my direct instructional lecture, and this, of course, is for Monday, and it's January 24th, 2022. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody. Please remember, on your desk, you should have your assignment book out and open. So as I walk around, I can go and certainly check it. In addition, make certain you have a blue or black pen. Again, you have multiple colored highlighters, correctable tape. But again, as I will say at the beginning of every Zoomcast, I'm going to respectfully ask you to refrain from using your correctable tape and your highlighters while you're watching the Zoomcast. It is really imperative that you are focusing, listening, and taking your really good copious notes in your ISN. You can always, once the Zoomcast is over, that's when you can go and clean up and then highlight your notes. And then remember, again, you guys have really improved a lot since the beginning of the school year. I really want you to, again, focus on just not writing down the main notes, but also adding additional oral notes as well. I want to see everybody making a concerted effort to do so. All right. So again, top right-hand corner, make sure that your notes have been dated for January 24, 2022. Top line, you need a topic heading, subject heading for every single page in your ISN, and you're going to write down for me factors of World War II. So dovetailing back to the previous direct instructional Zoomcast, I had introduced, of course, Joseph Stalin, one of our three evil dictators. We've already talked about Hitler. We've learned about Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, and now, of course, Joseph Stalin. And in one of the great ironies of history, again, Hitler was studying to be an artist. Again, wanted to attend the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Benito Mussolini was studying to be a school teacher, and Joseph Stalin was studying to be a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, we do know that Stalin was kicked out of the seminary. That is basically the school for training to become a priest, in this case, in the Russian Orthodox Church. Was it because he was caught cheating on an examination? Possibly. We also do know that Joseph Stalin was greatly influenced by two forbidden authors within the Russian Orthodox Church. If you were a seminarian, you were not allowed to read the works, again, of Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, the father of communism, and of course, again, the French author Victor Hugo, whose famous work Les Miserables talked about social unrest in a group of students trying to revolt in Paris, France. The R word, again, the revolution word, that is a word that is forbidden within the Russian government, with the Tsar, and of course, with the Russian Orthodox Church. All right, so I just gave you a quick little preview, or again, overview, synopsis of what we learned. Now let's get into it. Please write this down. So the year is 1904, and Stalin at this point, is trying to figure out his direction. Where is he going to go with his life? He's not going to be a priest anymore. So in 1904, Joseph Stalin is going to join what's called the Bolshevik Party in Russia. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's a photograph of Stalin at the turn of the 20th century, starting to look a lot more like the Joseph Stalin that you'll be recognizing as we get more and more into World War II. So the Bolshevik Party in 1904 had one big goal. There was two, actually, but I'm going to focus on the first one initially, and that was to overthrow Tsar Nicholas II. Remember, if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen or up to my laptop screen, this is a photograph of Tsar Nicholas II. Notice the year 1898, the cousin of King George V, and of course, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And number two, the other big goal of the Bolshevik Party was to install a new government, and that new government would be communism. Now, a couple of key things. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on communism because I'm going to be dovetailing back to it again when we get into the Cold War, which is our unit right after World War II. So a couple of key things in communism. This is based on the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx, one of the influences of Joseph Stalin. Number one, in communism, unlike in capitalism, there is no private property. You don't own your home. You don't own your backyard. It's owned communally, and in this instance, by the government. And number two, one of the key elements of communism is that there are no social classes. You don't see that distinction between the upper class, the middle class, the bourgeois, or the lower class, that in theory, according to Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, everybody would be equal in theory. And in addition, one of the things that the Bolsheviks were going to do is, unlike the fascists in Italy and in Germany, who tried to appeal to the middle class, the bourgeois, in the case of the Bolsheviks, they're really going to focus on the working class, the proletariats, your farmers, your factory workers, because that's really where the core of the population is. So another key element in 1904 is, so not only does Joseph Stalin join the Bolshevik Party in 1904, but this is where he meets one of the most significant players when you study the history of Russia, and especially when you're getting into 20th century history. And when you take world history at Stevenson next year, I know you're going to be learning about this guy a lot more. His name was Vladimir Lenin, or Lenin. So Vladimir Lenin was one of the key players in the Russian Revolution, first in terms of overthrowing Tsar Nicholas II, and then the second part of the Russian Revolution was determining what type of government and what type of economy Russia would embrace, and the answer will be communism, and then Russia will become part of a much bigger empire. We, of course, will know today, well, at the time, I should say, not today's Russia today, but at the time, it was known as the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. All right. So in 1924, now we're fast forwarding 20 years later. So in 1922, Vladimir Lenin was the first leader of this new empire, which Russia was the biggest player in, the biggest republic. And we, of course, know it as the Soviet Union. So Lenin was the first big leader. But in 1924, Lenin dies kind of unexpectedly. Nobody really saw this coming. So a couple of key points. Number one, so the story is that Vladimir Lenin had written allegedly this secret note. And in the secret note, he had expressed concerns prior to his death of Joseph Stalin becoming the next leader of the Soviet Union. So in actuality, the guy that Vladimir Lenin really kind of saw as becoming the next leader after Lenin of the Soviet Union was this guy right here. His name is Leon Trotsky. So what's going to happen is, after Lenin dies in 1924, there's a power struggle between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. And eventually what's going to happen is Joseph Stalin is going to emerge victorious. So he will become the second leader of the Soviet Union. Leon Trotsky will escape to Mexico, where he is assassinated by two hitmen that were hired by Joseph Stalin. And this kind of foreshadows, Joseph Stalin's reign of terror. And so as a result of, again, Stalin, outmaneuvering Leon Trotsky, he will become the second leader of what is known as the Soviet Union. All right. So I want you to skip a full page. We're going to come back to those notes. Don't worry. Once again, I'd like everybody to date your notes for today, January 24, 2022. Almost said 2021. I have to get myself in the habit of saying it. And you're going to write down for me guide questions, Joseph Stalin. So I'm going to share with you a couple of video clips today on Joseph Stalin. So let's start with the first one, some guide questions. So number one. So I want you to look for examples of propaganda that were used to enhance Joseph Stalin's image amongst the people of the Soviet Union. Remember, propaganda is when you're taking information. Frequently, you're distorting it, you're exaggerating it. And again, it's not meant to inform, it's meant to persuade. Now, in this instance, what Stalin is trying to do is use propaganda to enhance himself, to make himself look better amongst the people of the Soviet Union. So watch this video and see if you can find those examples of propaganda, which I introduced to you when we talked about World War I. Number two, how does the music aid and create an image of Joseph Stalin in this particular video? Shostakovich was the composer. All right, this is what I call Joseph Stalin, the face of evil. Here we go. So a couple of takeaways. Number one, again, one thing that our evil dictators all share in common, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, is how they all used propaganda to not only impact and negatively and adversely impact their opponents and their enemies, but also to cultivate an image for themselves. And in the case of Stalin, you notice the way he was waving and people were waving back. And notice they really focused on little children, how he was this benevolent old dude. There was nothing benevolent about Joseph Stalin. This gentleman right here was responsible, we estimate, that between basically 1928 until he passed away in 1953, between that period of time, we estimate that Joseph Stalin was responsible for the deaths of anywhere from 20 to 25, possibly all the way up to 50 million people perished as a result of what, as I like to describe it, Joseph Stalin's reign of terror. Trust me, when this propaganda, in terms of trying to create this image of this kindly old grandfatherly type of individual, there was nothing kind, there was nothing benevolent about Joseph Stalin. He was a brutal, nasty dictator. Let's continue on. So what we're going to do now is I want you to skip a full page, or if you want, you can go to the back of those notes you took on Stalin in terms of propaganda, just to save a page. And we're going to watch a really brief speech on by Joseph Stalin. So again, what we're going to focus on, I mean, this is brief, literally it's 30 seconds long, but I wanted to give you a perspective in terms of noticing the speaking style. We started with Adolf Schicklgruber. You had a chance to analyze Mussolini's speaking style. What about Joseph Stalin? So that's going to be the main thing I want you to focus on. And then number two, just really briefly, and again, this might be the shortest video clip I'm going to share with you guys this year. What is the point he was trying to make in this very brief speech? But again, the main focus, I would say, is I really want you to focus on his style, and you're comparing and contrasting. Compare means how are they alike? Contrast, how are they different? How would you compare Joseph Stalin's speaking style to that of, say, Benito Mussolini and Adolf Schicklgruber? So here we go. This is a very fast video clip. Just an FYI.
И эти люди, лишенные совести и чести, люди с моралью животных, имеют наглость призывать к уничтожению великой русской нации. Немецкие захватчики хотят иметь истребительную войну с народами СССР. Что же, если немцы хотят иметь истребительную войну, они ее получат.
Again, notice very different speaking style compared to, say, Benito Mussolini or Adolf Hitler. And then number two, Stalin's giving this speech in June of 1941 at the time when the Nazis have broken what you're going to learn about later on, which is the non-aggression pact. And then in 1941, Hitler double crosses Stalin, and we'll talk about the non-aggression pact later on, and it's called Operation Barbarossa. It's a full-scale invasion by Nazi Germany of the Soviet Union. So it's Stalin basically issuing a threat directed towards Adolf Hitler. Let's continue on. So go back a previous page. Let's just get back into our regular direct instructional notes. So by 1929, there is no doubt that Joseph Stalin is the undisputed leader of now the Soviet Union. He's number two. So Lenin was number one, Stalin was two. Again, Lenin had concerns about Stalin, really wanted to see Leon Trotsky become the next leader. Trotsky then flees to Mexico, where he's brutally murdered by two hitmen that were secured and hired by Joseph Stalin. So now there's no doubt who's calling the shots. So by 1929, Joseph Stalin is going to solidify his power, his control over the Soviet Union by doing two things. And this is an important part of the story because the Soviet Union is going to play a major role in the molding and shaping and ultimately the outcome of World War II. So number one, so starting in 1929, Joseph Stalin is going to embark upon the first of what he called his 5-year plans. So we call this a 5-year plan because it lasted 5 years, but there's multiple 5-year plans that Joseph Stalin had created. So one of the things that Stalin is going to do is, number one, he's going to begin what's called the collectivization of all the small farms scattered throughout the Soviet Union. It's a big empire going from basically Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So one of the key places that he will target is the Ukraine today, which ironically right now, there's a lot of issues between the Ukraine and Russia, as Russia has been mobilizing troops there, and we'll see how this plays out. Hopefully we won't witness another war. But anyway, getting back to my original story. So 1929, Stalin is going to start taking all these small farms, okay? And he's going to basically collect them all together. Now, the question is why? So a couple of reasons. Number one, Stalin looked at the world around him, and he looks in 1929 and he sees Germany, that's a modern industrial nation. France is a modern industrial nation. Great Britain is a modern industrial nation. The United States, ditto. Whereas the Soviet Union was still kind of stuck in the 18th and 17th and 16th centuries, very backwards, very agrarian. And he realized that in order for the Soviet Union to compete with those aforementioned countries, that you would need to industrialize. You need to shift the economy away from agriculture and focus much more on industry, mass production. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, you're going to see a lot more factories being built, but with more factories, you need workers. Where are the workers going to come from? And the answer is he's trying to force the small farmers off of their farms and move to big cities like Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, or what was St. Petersburg, now is we're calling it Leningrad, and another big city, and it's called Stalingrad. Now, number two, but there's another reason why Stalin is doing this. He's collectivizing all these small farms. So number one, he wants to shift the economy of the Soviet Union from an agrarian society more based on an industrial society. And number two, in addition, he felt that these small farmers were still kind of caught in a time warp, that they were still practicing the same farming techniques that you would have seen in the 19th and 18th and the 17th centuries. And he felt it would be much more efficient for the Soviet government to create what he would call these mega farms, these huge farms that the government would control. And he felt that if the government controlled these farms, they would be more efficient, be able to grow more food. And at the same time, you're shifting these farmers over to the big cities like Moscow and Stalingrad and Leningrad, which again was St. Petersburg, is back St. Petersburg today, and force them to work in the factories. Now, this is where you start to see Joseph Stalin's dark side really starting to come into play. So some farmers, whether you were a small farmer in Russia or where Joseph Stalin came from, Georgia, or of course, Ukraine, they resisted. Their families have been living on these farms for hundreds of years, and they weren't about to ready to leave. So what was the outcome? So number one, this is where you start to see the brutal side of Joseph Stalin. So again, if you resisted Stalin and you chose not to leave your farm, Stalin would send in, again, the government, the police or the army, and you would be sent to what's called a gulag. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's a photograph of a Soviet-style gulag. And I would draw a line off to the side. What are gulags? Gulags are basically Soviet prison camps, jails, same difference. And where a lot of these gulags located, and I would draw another line off to the side and add this as a side oral note, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are located in what's called Siberia, way up in the northern part of the Soviet Union, up by the Arctic Circle, where it gets extremely cold. Now, again, before I get to my other point, so if you get sent to one of these gulags, there's a very good chance you're never going to leave. And so if you end up in a gulag up in Siberia and the way up by the Arctic Circle in the most northern reaches of the Soviet Union, chances are you're going to die from exposure due to the cold, disease, or a lack of nutrition. Which takes me to my next point, number two. So another one of Joseph Stalin's more infamous tactics was mass starvation. So if you were farmers that refused to leave your small farms and move to the big cities to go work in a factory, what Stalin would do is he would attempt to starve you to death. So there were stories of where, again, the Soviet army would go into a small village and they would round up all the food and lock it up in silos. So people would have those towers you would see in a barn. And basically, he was trying to starve you into submission. So I have 3 photographs, and what I would like you to do now is I want you to pause the Zoomcast for about 2 minutes. And right now, I would like for you to take about 2 to 3 minutes, and I would like you to describe this photograph right here, this photograph right here, and then this photograph down here. So take about 2 to 3 minutes to reflect on it, because this is what happens when you cross Joseph Stalin. And notice one thing I will tell you about these photographs, what they all have in common, they're all children. I'm going to continue on, however. All right, moving on. So in addition to his 5-year plan, so another thing that Stalin was notorious for in basically not gaining power, but solidifying and expanding his power, is he begins what's called his purges. So the purges really get started in 1935, and there's a series of purges all the way until 1951 when Stalin died. I think I originally said it was 53, but I think he died in 51, if my memory serves me correctly. So a couple of key points. Number one, so Joseph Stalin, again, is going to dovetail off of the czars like Nicholas II and Alexander III, and again, Ivan the Terrible. They all had their own forms of a secret police. So the Soviet Union does the same thing. And it was called the NKVD, which again is the ancestor, the precursor to the KGB, which I'll be mentioning when we get into the Cold War. And so the secret police would go, and basically a purge is, in Stalin's mind, it was a cleansing of the Soviet Union. So what he would do is he would use the NKVD, the Russian secret police or the Soviet secret police, and they would round up anybody that Stalin would consider to be an enemy or a potential enemy or somebody who was disloyal to him. And as these 2 gentlemen are going to find out, they're going to be executed by this gentleman right here with the NKVD. So again, who would be targeted? So number one, Stalin would use the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, going after anybody that Stalin in his war-sick and paranoid mind thought were supporters of Vladimir Lenin or Leon Trotsky, his arch nemesis. Remember, it was Lenin who wrote that secret note that, again, had some grave concerns about Joseph Stalin becoming the eventual leader of the Soviet Union. Or number 2, Stalin would again use the NKVD to round up anybody that he felt could be potentially disloyal to him, be a traitor to the Soviet cause, and potentially be an obstacle to Joseph Stalin. So that pretty much targets anybody in Joseph Stalin's warped mind. So the end result is, as a result of these purges, okay, we estimate, and again, this is just an estimate, that 20 million people in the Soviet Union died as a result of these purges. And Stalin was ready to start another purge right around the time of his death in 1951. Let's continue on. So Joseph Stalin's purges, okay, this cleansing, as he liked to describe it, which was just a euphemism for just trying to get rid of anybody that he believed was an enemy of his. Again, Stalin had these imaginary assassins all out trying to get him. So his attitude is, I'm going to get you before you get me. So Stalin's purges, okay, and this doesn't take into account the 5-year plans where, again, he collectivizes the farms and tries to force the farmers off their land to the big cities. And again, he ends up either sending them to gulags or, again, just simply trying to starve them to death. So the purges were important for 3 reasons. Number 1, so again, dovetailing back into his 5-year plans, you will see again in the 1930s, 1935, 1945 through 1951, mass executions. Hundreds, thousands of citizens of the Soviet Union will be rounded up and be executed as, in Stalin's mind, enemies of the state. And number 2, again, we go back to the 5-year plans for those farmers, whether you were in the Ukraine or you were in, again, Russia or Georgia, any of these republics of the Soviet Union, you refuse to go and comply, you would end up going to a gulag, a Soviet-style prison camp, way up in the northern part of the Soviet Union, up by the Arctic Circle in Siberia. And number 2, another reason why this was important, besides the fact you're going to see mass executions and people being sent to these gulags, never to escape, by the way. And number 3, One of the groups in the Soviet Union that Stalin targeted was the Soviet Union's Red Army. He didn't trust his generals because he always feared there might be a potential, it's called a coup d'etat. It's French for an attempt to overthrow the government. So even as some of his generals that he suspected in his mind might be disloyal were rounded up and either executed or sent to one of these gulags. And this is going to weaken the Soviet Union at the time when the Nazis are going to double cross the Soviets after they break what's called the Non-Aggression Pact in 1939, and they launch a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union, which is part of what's called Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941. Another story for another time. All right, I want you to skip a full page, and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. And as we wrap up Joseph Stalin today, again, I'd like you to date your notes one more time. It's January 24, 2022. Going to share a very powerful video clip. I found this a couple years ago. It's entitled Joseph Stalin, A Brief History. And I think what this video is going to do, it's going to do a nice job of tying together all the loose ends on, again, why Joseph Stalin is right up there with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini as our evil dictators of World War II. All right, so here we go. Number one. So first guide question. This video is going to do a nice job of tying together all the loose ends in the story that I've shared with you thus far. So number one, what was Russia renamed after the Russian Revolution? Again, I'm going to go through these guide questions relatively quickly because I know you guys do a great job of pausing the video to give yourself a chance to get caught up and write the questions down. And I love that because then it gives me the flexibility of just moving along. Number two, what were Joseph Stalin's primary goals as the dictator of the Soviet Union? So this is going to dovetail and circle back to what I talked about earlier with the 5-year plans and, of course, Stalin's infamous purges. Number three, what was Stalin's policy of collective farming? And what was its goal? It's a two-part question. And again, make sure you're skipping a couple lines between each guide question. Number four, how did the Ukraine, or now we just say Ukraine, respond to this policy? What was the outcome? What were the stats? So remember, at the time when Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was not a free independent country like it is today. It was part of this empire right next door to Russia. Next guide question. How did Joseph Stalin industrialize the Soviet Union? And what were Stalin's 5-year plans? Again, dovetailing off of what I talked about earlier, elaborating a bit. What were Stalin's purges? And again, any stats, anytime you hear stats, statistics, write it down. I might not necessarily ask you how many people in the Soviet Union died as a result of the purges, but I might use that statistic as a context clue, or maybe one of your answer choices. Could be, possibly. So that's why it's always important, jot it down. What was the Great Purge? And how many Russians died as a result of it? And then finally, I know this is a lengthy video clip, but I think it's a very powerful one. I want you to describe for me life in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin in his reign of terror, from basically 1924 all the way until about 1953. And how he used the media and how he used propaganda to cultivate and create this image of Joseph Stalin in the minds of the Soviet people. In addition, how many Russians, how many Soviets? Remember, Russia is just the biggest republic and the most influential republic of the Soviet Union. And based on this video clip, how many Russians, or more exactly, how many Soviets? Because remember, Georgia, where he was from, that was a republic. Ukraine was a republic. How many died as a result of his policies? Again, taking into account the 5-year plans and his purges. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so here we go. So this video is about 4.5 minutes long, does a great job of basically summarizing the essence of Joseph Stalin, one of the major players of World War II. Here we go.
In Russia, hopes of a democracy forming crumbled with the outbreak of a civil war, which resulted in the formation of the world's first communist state. How did this experiment work out? Who emerged as its leader? After the end of the Russian Civil War, a new government was formed under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. Russia was renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or simply the Soviet Union. After Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin, whose last name means man of steel, seized control and sought to create the model communist state. Stalin made industrial and agricultural growth his primary goals. He abolished privately owned farms and replaced them with collectives, which were large government-owned farms. Under Stalin's policy of collective farming, peasants were forced to give up control of their land. Some were allowed to continue farming, but the crops were seized by the government. This policy gave the Soviet Union control of farm production and was designed to force many of the farmers into the cities to work in factories. In Western Russia, particularly in the Ukraine, there was fierce resistance to this policy. Stalin sent the Red Army to run the farmers off of their land and confiscate the crops. Millions were executed or sent to work in forced labor camps known as gulags. More than 7 million Ukrainians starved to death during the forced famines of 1932 and 1933. Stalin also hoped to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union and make it an industrial power. In 1928, Stalin presented the first of a series of 5-year plans to direct this massive industrialization. The Soviet economy was placed entirely under government control. By 1937, the program had resulted in the USSR becoming the world's second largest industrial power, surpassed only by the United States. The forced industrialization did come with an enormous human cost, as the factories were poorly constructed and worker safety was neglected. Stalin also sought to purge or eliminate everyone who might threaten his power. During the 1930s, Stalin banished 36% of all Communist Party members from the party. Thousands were put on public trial and executed or sentenced to forced labor camps in Siberia. The harsh punishment of Stalin's opposition is known as the Great Purge, and historians estimate that it resulted in the death of no less than 23 million Russians. By 1939, Stalin had transformed the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state. Under his rule, the Soviet government exerted complete control over its citizens. Individuals enjoyed no personal freedoms, and they were expected to obey Stalin's orders without question. Anyone who opposed or criticized his rule was permanently silenced. Stalin's government controlled the newspapers, radio broadcasts, and every other form of communication. He used the media to distribute propaganda, praising himself and his policies, while exercising censorship by monitoring the work of writers. By the end of the decade, Joseph Stalin had suppressed all opposition and ruled over the Soviet Union with an iron fist. Many estimate that his policies were responsible for the deaths of more than 50 million Russians.
So again, just to summarize, over anywhere, we don't really know the exact number. When I was in college, we were told 20 to 25 million, again, Soviets died as a result of Stalin's policies, whether it was the 5-year plan or, again, going back to those purges. And now that number is skyrocketed to 50 million. Some would even estimate that Joseph Stalin was responsible for anywhere from 50 to 60 million people died as a result of his brutal desire to not only, again, secure his power and expand his power, but again, his desire to industrialize the Soviet Union in competition with other countries in, of course, Europe. But as I always would say, but at what price did the Soviet people have to pay for Stalin's brutal ways? So at this point, I would like everybody to please go. And now you're going to take out your correctable tape. And I want you to go through all of your notes today. And I'd like for you to clean up anything that you crossed out or traced over. In addition, now I want you to take multiple colored highlighters. And I want you to use your highlighters, tip of the tip. And I want you to focus again on those words you can visualize in your mind, those persons and places and things. Don't just be highlighting entire sentences. That's just coloring. And remember, you're still not done. You got to go back and take about 10 to 15 minutes and review everything that you wrote today in your ISN. You practice for soccer, you practice for cricket, you practice swimming. Why aren't you practicing for school? It's no different. If you have an opportunity, hand your ISN to your mom or dad or somebody in your house, or maybe create, again, a FaceTime session or a Zoom session with another classmate and teach and explain all the information that we covered today. You channel your inner Mr. Bonk and talk about, again, Stalin joining the Bolshevik Party and what were its goals, and Stalin meeting Vladimir Lenin, and who was Vladimir Lenin, major player when you study the Russian Revolution and the early history of the Soviet Union. Who was Stalin competing with after Lenin had died mysteriously in 1924? Some wondered, was he poisoned? Was he poisoned? We don't really know. There was never an autopsy done. In addition, again, when Stalin eventually defeats Leon Trotsky, and he's now the full dictator of the Soviet Union, what were his 5-year plans? What were his purges? What was the purpose behind both? And what was the end result? Yes, the Soviet Union industrialized and became the second biggest industrial power in the world after the United States. But at what price, what cost did the Soviet people have to pay for the brutality of Joseph Stalin, one of our 3 evil dictators of World War II? So again, I hope everybody enjoyed today's direct instructional Zoomcast as much as I enjoyed making it. For my next direct instructional Zoomcast, we're going to be focusing on another of the factors of World War II. So we learn, of course, about Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin. Now we're going to be shifting gears and we're going to be focusing on the Pacific theater of the war, the fighting with the Empire of Japan. And it all goes back to what we call the Sino-Japanese Wars between 1931 all the way until the end of the war, 1945. So as I always like to say, as I wrap up one of my Zoomcasts, the story may have ended today, but you better believe the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much again. And as always, please be well.